In the heart of Nebraska, there's a place people rarely talk about. It's a stretch of cornfields that stretches endlessly, where the rows of golden stalks sway gently in the wind. Yet there's something unsettling about the way the land feels. The air smells thick, not just with the scent of ripe crops, but something darker, heavier. Most locals avoid driving through these fields, especially after the sun sets. The moonlight casts long, eerie shadows that dance across the land, and as the wind rustles the leaves, you hear whispers, almost as if the corn itself is speaking, telling secrets long buried. They say something is out there, something not quite human. Not that anyone can exactly explain what it is, but there's a feeling you can't shake once you're near the fields. A sense of being watched, of being followed, even when you're completely alone. It's as if the earth itself holds a grudge. Some townspeople, especially the older generation, claim the land is cursed, that it's been that way for generations. The cornfields are not just a patch of land. They're a reminder of something darker, something that happened many years ago. And it's still watching, still waiting. The tale began with a small farming community in the early 1900s, before the roads were paved and the world around Nebraska was as wild as the land itself. Back then, the field stretched further than the eye could see, and the land was rich, fertile, and full of promise. The settlers that came here were farmers, drawn by the promise of abundant crops. Corn, wheat, and barley grew tall in the fertile soil, and the townspeople began to make a name for themselves as the heart of Nebraska's agricultural scene. Life seemed simple, slow, and steady, with the long workdays spent under the hot sun and the evenings filled with quiet conversations on the porches. But the farmers weren't the only ones who were drawn to this land. Something else came to Nebraska long before the settlers arrived. Something ancient and forgotten. The first whispers about the old ways came from the oldest families in town. Families whose ancestors had lived in the area for generations. They spoke in hushed tones of a time long before the settlers had made their mark. A time when the land was untamed and the spirits of the earth were both revered and feared. I spoke of rituals, strange ceremonies that had been practiced for centuries. Rituals meant to honor the land and appease the ancient spirits that called it home. But it was never clear exactly what these rituals entailed. The old-timers in the town would mention these ceremonies casually, almost like they were recalling a forgotten tradition, but their eyes would darken and their voices would lower when they did. They'd tell you to stay away from the fields after dark, to avoid walking through the tall corn rows alone. And if you ever felt the strange pull of the land, the urge to go deeper into the fields. You should fight it, because once you gave in, once you wandered too far, you might never return. The settlers didn't believe in such things. They thought the old ways were just that, old stories meant to frighten children and keep them in line. They didn't understand the true power of the land they had settled on. They didn't know that beneath the soil, something dark stirred, something older than the town itself, something that was only waiting for the right time to awaken. It was a power that had been forgotten by all but the oldest families. A power that had been lying dormant for centuries, but now, with the town's growth and the settlement of more land, it began to stir once again. For years, the people lived in peace, unaware of the dark presence in the fields. But as the years passed, strange things began happening. The corn, once so abundant, began to wither. The weather was perfect. There were no droughts, no storms, but the crops refused to thrive. Livestock disappeared without a trace. No blood, no signs of struggle, just empty pens and the silence of the night. At first, it was written off as coyotes or other wild animals. But when it started happening more frequently, the townspeople began to grow uneasy. Whispers of something more sinister began to spread. Some people claimed to have seen strange figures moving through the cornfields at night. Tall shadows that didn't belong to the land. Others heard the faintest sounds, a soft murmur, like a chant, carried by the wind, though no one could say from where it came. That's when the disappearances started. It was the children at first, the ones who strayed too far from home, too curious for their own good. They'd be playing near the edges of the fields, chasing fireflies, or exploring the dense undergrowth. And then, without a trace, they were gone. It happened so suddenly and without warning. There would be no screams, no signs of struggle. Parents would search the fields for days, sometimes weeks, but they would find nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. No one dared to venture too far into the fields to search. The fear was too great. And then, one day, it wasn't just the children who went missing. It was adults too. The people who had lived in the town for years, who had known the land as well as anyone, began disappearing. There were no clues left behind, no tracks, no signs of foul play. The townspeople became afraid to leave their homes after nightfall, and the once bustling streets of the town became eerily quiet. The air seemed thicker, colder, as if the land itself had begun to choke the life out of the people who had settled on it. The old-timers, the ones who had whispered about the old ways, grew even more nervous. They knew that the land's ancient power had been disturbed. They knew that the rituals had been interrupted, that the spirits of the land were angry. They had been forgotten for too long, and now the price was being paid. The whispers grew louder. Some said the land itself had become cursed, that the spirits were seeking vengeance on those who had disturbed their peace. Others spoke of the return of the cult, a secret group that had once worshipped the ancient powers of the land, a group that had disappeared after performing dark rituals many years ago. No one knew if these were just stories to frighten children, but the disappearances kept happening, and the townspeople could no longer ignore the truth. The evil that had been buried for centuries was alive again, and it was waiting for them. The town was falling apart, both physically and spiritually. The once rich land was now barren. The crops dead, the soil corrupted. No one dared to speak the name of the land's curse out loud, but everyone felt it. The fields were no longer a place of life, they were a place of death. And it was only a matter of time before the land would claim even more souls. In the heart of Nebraska, the cornfields continued to stretch, endless and silent, watching, waiting, and as the wind blew through the tall stalks, it carried with it the faintest echo of a chant, a reminder that some things, once disturbed, never truly die. One cold autumn night, strange things began happening. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a quiet whisper in the air that no one could quite place. The animals, once so abundant in the area, began disappearing. The dogs, the cats, the birds, everything. One morning, a farmer went out to check on his livestock and found his prized cow missing, just like that. No tracks in the mud, no sign of a struggle, just an empty pen. He thought it was coyotes at first, but it didn't make sense. Coyotes don't take an entire cow without a trace. Days passed, and more animals vanished, as if the land was swallowing them up. At the same time, something was happening to the cornfields. The once lush, golden stalks that had stretched proudly toward the sky began to wither. At first, the farmers thought it was just the changing seasons, perhaps a brief, unexpected drought, but the weather had been perfect. There was no reason for the corn to die like that. The soil was still rich, the weather warm, the rain came when it was supposed to. Yet, the crops seemed to be shrinking, turning brown and rotting at the roots. By the time the first frost hit, the once vibrant fields were a shadow of their former selves, barren, empty, and lifeless. There was something unnatural about the way the corn died. The once plentiful land had been reduced to a cold, unfeeling wasteland, and the farmers couldn't understand it. Rumors began to spread. Some said it was the work of a curse. Others whispered of a spirit angered by the intrusion of the settlers. No one knew for sure, but everyone could feel it. The presence. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, the whispers grew louder. At first, they were faint, carried on the breeze, barely audible, so soft, you could almost convince yourself you were imagining them.
But then, the whispers started to come more frequently. Sometimes, it was like a hum in the back of your mind, like a memory trying to break free. The sounds drifted across the town, floating out from the fields and seeping into every home. At night, you'd hear them through the windows, low, unintelligible murmurs. Some said they were the wind. Others swore it was something far more sinister, something calling from deep within the earth.
It was on a night like that, with the wind howling through the dead cornfields and the whispers carrying through the empty streets, that the first disappearance happened. At first, it was just one child, a little girl named Sarah, who went missing. Her parents were frantic, searching the fields, knocking on doors, asking anyone and everyone if they had seen her. But no one had. There were no signs, no clues, no evidence of what happened. The little girl was simply gone, vanished, without a trace. Then came more. One by one, the town's children began disappearing. A boy named Luke, then Emily, and then others. Each time, it was the same. No signs of a struggle. No blood. Just empty homes and heartbroken parents. The townspeople searched for days, even weeks, but no trace of the children was ever found. They scoured the fields, the woods, and every corner of the town, but it was as though the children had vanished into thin air. The children were gone, and the town was left with nothing but grief and confusion. The people turned to the only source of comfort they knew, the church. They gathered there, praying for the children's safe return, hoping that the Lord would intervene and put an end to the terror. But even the preacher, a man who had dedicated his life to the service of God, seemed unsettled. His sermons, once full of hope and salvation, began to sound hollow. His eyes were tired, haunted by a look that no one had ever seen before. He spoke of faith, of prayers, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. The town was no longer just haunted by fear. It was haunted by something much worse. Something that the preacher could no longer ignore. It was said that the spirits of the land had returned, that the ancient rituals of old had been disturbed, and now the land was demanding a price. But it wasn't enough to simply take lives. The spirits wanted something deeper, something more. They wanted blood. A debt had been left unpaid for generations, and now the time had come for it to be settled. The old-timers in the town, the ones who had always whispered about the rituals, grew more and more anxious. They knew the price was coming. They had always known that one day the land would call for its debt. The rituals, which had been practiced long before the settlers arrived, had been meant to appease the spirits of the land. But when the settlers arrived, those rituals had been forgotten, ignored, and replaced with prayers and offerings to a god who didn't know the land's ancient ways. The old-timers had always warned that there would be consequences. They had always known that the land would demand its payment, that the spirits wouldn't stay silent forever. Now, the price was being paid in blood. The spirits of the land, the forgotten deities who had once ruled the earth, were angry. They were hungry, and they would stop at nothing to claim what was owed to them. As the days turned into weeks, the town's fear grew. The whispers became louder, the disappearances more frequent. Parents locked their doors at night, afraid that their children might be next. No one was safe. The streets, once full of life and chatter, were now eerily silent. People stopped going out after dark, and those who had lived in the town their entire lives began to leave, fleeing from something they didn't fully understand, but knew was far too real. The preacher, once a man of unwavering faith, began to question everything he had ever believed. He spoke of the old ways, of the rituals and sacrifices that had once been made to appease the spirits. He spoke of the blood debt that had been left unforgiven, and he began to fear. But the price was steep. The land had already taken so much, and it was hungry for more. And so, as the town descended into chaos, the people were left with no choice but to wonder how much blood would be required to satisfy the land's insatiable hunger. Would it be the blood of their children? Would it be their own? The curse had come for them, and no one was safe. As the disappearances continued, the fear that hung over the town grew thicker, heavier, until it was nearly suffocating. It wasn't just the children anymore. Whole families had disappeared without a trace. The cornfields, once a symbol of prosperity and life, had turned into a dark and terrifying place. One where even the bravest souls dared not venture after sunset. The once bustling streets of the town had become eerily quiet. With locked doors and curtained windows, people spoke in hushed tones. Their conversations always tinged with dread and uncertainty. But with each passing day, the terror grew more tangible. Whispers started to circulate. Stories that no one dared to fully believe, but could not entirely ignore. There were talks of a cult, a secretive group that had taken refuge deep within the cornfields, hiding in the shadows where no one could see them. The rumors were vague, yet persistent, always whispered between the lines of conversations. They were said to worship something ancient, something dark,
something that had been forgotten by time, but was very much alive. The cultists, as the townspeople called them, were said to have made a pact long ago with an entity, a being that promised them power, immortality, and knowledge in exchange for something precious: blood. The town, unaware of these dark dealings, had unknowingly allowed the cult's influence to take root. And now, it seemed, the cult was demanding what was promised. As the townspeople tried to make sense of the disappearances, they began to notice something strange. The moon. On nights when the moon was full, the disappearances seemed to escalate. It was as if the full moon marked the beginning of something terrible. A time when the cult would emerge from the darkness of the cornfields to perform their twisted ceremonies. These rituals, it was said, were conducted under the cover of night, when the rest of the world was asleep and oblivious to the horrors unfolding just beyond the town's borders. The cultists, cloaked in dark robes, would gather in a circle, their chants filling the air, their hands raised to the heavens as they invoked the name of the dark being they worshipped. The air would grow thick with an unnatural energy, and the earth beneath their feet would seem to tremble with anticipation.
A most chilling part of the rumors was what happened to the people who ventured too close to these ceremonies. It wasn't just that they disappeared. It was what happened to those who returned. They would come back, sometimes days, sometimes weeks later, but they were never the same. Their eyes would be vacant, empty, hollowed out as if their very souls had been ripped away. They would speak in strange tongues, words no one could understand, muttering about blood, about sacrifice, and about the dark power that had taken hold of them. Their spirits seemed broken, like they had been hollowed out from the inside. And though they walked among the living, they were little more than shells of who they had once been. It wasn't long before the people of the town began to draw connections between the growing number of disappearances and the strange behaviors of those who had returned. It became clear that something terrible was happening in the cornfields. The very land that had once provided for the town now seemed to be consuming its people. But no one knew exactly what the cult was after, or how deep its roots went. Those who had once been the pillars of the community began to fade away, one by one, consumed by fear and dread. The sheriff, a man who had spent his life protecting the town, became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He led search parties into the fields, hoping to find some evidence, some clue that would explain the madness that had overtaken their peaceful little town. But every attempt to find the cult or its hidden rituals
ended in failure. No one could ever find them. It was as if the cultists were ghosts, invisible in the night, slipping away into the shadows whenever someone got too close. In desperation, the sheriff turned to the town's elders, those who remembered the old ways and spoke of things that had been lost to time. They told him of the land's ancient history, of the rituals performed long before the settlers arrived. Rituals meant to appease the spirits that had once ruled the earth. They spoke of the blood debt that had been left unpaid, of the ancient power that still lurked beneath the soil, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The sheriff, growing more and more desperate, began to believe that these stories were not just superstitions, but that they contained a terrible truth. The cult, it seemed, had made a pact with the land itself, a pact that was now coming to collect its due. As the nights grew longer and the moon grew fuller, the town's fear reached a breaking point. People began to leave, packing up their belongings and fleeing into the night, hoping to escape the horrors that had claimed their town. But even as they left, they couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness would follow them. The cult's influence seemed to stretch farther than anyone had imagined, and the land itself seemed to hunger for more souls. The remaining townspeople huddled together, unsure of who to trust and terrified of what the next night would bring. They knew that they were being hunted, that something in the cornfields was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. No one dared to speak the cult's name aloud, but the fear of it hung in the air like a thick fog, choking the life out of the town. The once thriving community was now a shell of its former self, a place where people no longer smiled or laughed, but only whispered in fear, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were living on borrowed time. The cult, hidden in the shadows, was slowly tightening its grip on the town, and no one seemed able to stop it. The only thing left was the land itself, the fields that had once fed the town, but had now become a place of horror. The cornfields, stretching endlessly under the moonlight, seemed to hold all the answers. But they were answers that no one wanted to know. Answers that came at a cost no one was willing to pay. The town was crumbling under the weight of these horrors, its people lost to fear and to the dark forces that had claimed the land as their own. The cult was not just a group of fanatics. It was a presence, a force that had been waiting for generations to rise again. And now it had begun to reclaim its power, one life at a time. The cornfields were its sanctuary, and the full moon its ally. The whispers in the night were the voices of those who had been taken, the souls of the lost who now served a darker purpose. And the town, once full of life, was now nothing more than a pawn in the hands of something far more ancient and powerful than they could have ever imagined.
One night, a group of curious teenagers, no older than 16 or 17, gathered by the edge of town near the old cornfields. They had heard the rumors, the whispers, and the chilling tales, but like many in the town, they had dismissed them as nothing more than superstitions, stories meant to scare children, nothing more. But the curiosity, that gnawing need to know the truth, was too much to ignore. The older generations had warned them, cautioning them against venturing into the fields at night. But the teens, eager to prove the adults wrong, decided they would venture out and see for themselves. Armed with little more than flashlights and the daring confidence that only youth can bring, they crossed the border of the town's outskirts and entered the dark, silent expanse of the cornfields. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, the long rows of corn swaying gently in the night breeze. The fields, once a place of life and sustenance, now seemed alien, sinister. The once familiar hum of insects and the rustle of animals had gone silent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. The group walked deeper into the cornfields, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. But the further they went, the more the air seemed to thicken. The whispers of the town, the ones that spoke of a cult, of dark rituals, and of ancient blood debts, echoed in their minds. But they kept walking, trying to convince themselves that it was all just stories. The moonlight flickered off the tips of the corn stalks, casting strange shadows on the ground that seemed to move and twist with a mind of their own. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, the wind stronger, and the sense of being watched grew more intense. Every rustle in the corn, every shadow that moved in the corner of their eyes made their hearts race. The world around them seemed to be closing in, but they pressed on, determined to uncover the truth, even if it was terrifying. They had almost convinced themselves that it was just the fear of the unknown that made their hearts pound in their chests. But something told them this was different. The land, the very earth beneath their feet, felt alive, alive with something ancient and hungry. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking,
They arrived at the center of the fields. It was a place they hadn't expected to find. A clearing, just large enough for the group to gather in. But there was something there. Something that made their stomachs turn. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient altar, made of stone, covered in strange symbols. The carvings on the altar were unlike anything they had ever seen, twisting, intricate patterns that seemed to move and shift in the dim light of their flashlights, as if they were alive, breathing. Around the altar were old, tattered robes, some hanging from the nearby trees, others scattered across the ground, as though they had been abandoned in haste. The air was thick with the unmistakable stench of decay, of death. The smell was overpowering, and the teens felt the weight of it settle in their chests, suffocating them. But the worst part, the altar was stained with blood, fresh blood. The bright red liquid gleamed in the moonlight, soaking into the stone, forming dark streaks that seemed to pulse and shimmer, as if they had a life of their own. The teens froze in place, their flashlights shaking in their hands. The rumors had been true. Everything they had dismissed as nonsense was right here in front of them. Undeniable, horrifying. The blood, still wet and glistening, seemed to call to them, urging them to come closer, to understand what had happened, what had been done here. The group stood motionless, their eyes locked on the altar, unable to move, unable to comprehend the horror they were witnessing. They had ventured into the heart of darkness, and there was no turning back now. And then they heard it. A sound so low, so quiet, that at first they thought it was just the wind. But as it grew louder, as it echoed through the air like a dark, rhythmic pulse, they realized it was chanting. It was coming from all around them, from the very depths of the cornfields. The sound was unsettling, hypnotic, the words indistinct, but filled with an ancient, foreign power. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, as if calling them, pulling them into the very heart of the nightmare. Panic set in. The teens' legs began to shake, their hearts hammering in their chests. They turned, ready to run, to flee from the horrors they had uncovered. But something had changed. The cornfields, once wide and open, now seemed to stretch on forever, closing in around them like a trap. The wind howled. The shadows of the corn seemed to move and shift, and the air felt thick with an oppressive weight. No matter where they turned, no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't seem to escape. It was as if the land itself was trapping them, holding them in place, waiting for something to happen. The chanting grew louder still, and the air grew colder, colder than it had any right to be for an autumn night. The shadows, dark and deep, seemed to move closer, creeping toward them. The teens could feel eyes upon them, not just from one direction, but from all around. They weren't alone. Whatever had been calling them, whatever had been waiting in the darkness, was now among them.
In their panic, one of the teens screamed, the sound piercing the night, but it was swallowed by the fields. It was as if the sound didn't exist, as if their cries were muted by the very land they stood on. They stumbled over the uneven ground, tripping over roots and fallen branches, but it didn't matter. The land wouldn't let them go. They were trapped, surrounded by the unseen, by the ancient power that had waited for so long, and then they saw it. From the darkness of the corn, figures began to emerge. Tall, cloaked figures, their faces hidden in shadow. They moved with a deliberate slowness, their steps soft but steady, as though they had all the time in the world. The teens tried to back away, but the figures were closing in, the chanting, now a maddening, rhythmic roar, drowned out all other sound. The teens could feel the presence of the figures, the coldness radiating from them, and they knew, deep down. But before they could make another move, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The air crackled with dark energy, and the full moon, once a pale beacon in the sky, now seemed to cast an oppressive red glow over everything. The earth itself seemed to rise up, as if responding to the call of the cult. In that moment, the teens realized what had happened. They had walked into a ritual that had been waiting for them, designed for them, and there was no escape. No one ever escapes the cornfields. With one final, deafening roar, the land claimed them. The town had never been the same after that night. The morning that followed the teens' disappearance was one of profound silence. The whole town seemed to breathe in unison, as if holding its collective breath, knowing that something irreversible had happened. The fields, once the symbol of life and sustenance, had become something else, something dark and heavy with the weight of history and blood. The whispers, faint at first, now carried across every corner of the town, drifting on the wind like a haunting refrain, always lingering in the back of their minds. As weeks passed, the signs became undeniable. The crops, which had once thrived under the careful hands of the farmers, now withered and died. It didn't matter how much water was poured into the soil, or how many hours the farmers spent trying to revive the fields. The plants refused to grow, and the earth seemed to reject every seed they planted. The crops would grow, only to turn sickly and rot at the roots, no matter the season. It was as though the land itself had become cursed, as if it was punishing them for something they couldn't understand, something
they had all ignored for too long.
The disappearances didn't stop either. One by one, more people vanished. It wasn't just the children anymore. Entire families were lost, leaving behind empty homes and unanswered questions. And the worst part, no one was ever found. The land had become a graveyard, and no one dared to speak of what lay beneath its surface. Those who ventured too close to the cornfields were never seen again. It was as if the earth had opened its jaws, swallowed them whole, and sealed itself shut, leaving only a faint, unsettling sense of something wrong in the air. And then there were the whispers. At first, they were just rumors, stories told by the frightened, the ones who had lost loved ones, or the ones who had heard strange sounds in the night. But as the days wore on, the whispers became louder, more insistent. They could be heard in the dead of night, drifting through the streets, carrying with them an unnatural chill. People began to hear them in their homes, in the corners of rooms, in the wind that rattled their windows. Some said it was the spirits of the lost. Others claimed it was the wind itself. But whatever it was, it felt like a presence, one that was never truly there, but always hovering on the edge of perception. As the town slowly descended into madness, a man, ragged, disheveled, and wild-eyed, came stumbling into town one evening. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, and his eyes haunted by something no one could comprehend. He was the last survivor of the cult, the last person to escape the horrors that had claimed the others, and his arrival was like the final crack in the town's fragile foundation. He was barely coherent, speaking in fragments, his words slurred and broken, but it was enough to understand the horrors he had witnessed. He told them of the rituals, the sacrifices, the bloodshed, and the price that had been paid. His voice trembled as he recounted the nightmarish ceremonies, the chanting, the blood that flowed like a river under the full moon. He spoke of the altar, the stone, the symbols that twisted and moved as if alive, and the figure that had stood at the center of it all. He told them of the dark pact the cult had made, a pact that had bound them to the land, to the very earth beneath their feet. They had offered their blood, their very souls, to an ancient force in exchange for power, immortality, control, knowledge, but the cost had been greater than they could have ever imagined. The man's voice shook as he told them that the blood was the key. It wasn't just any blood. It was the blood of the innocent, the blood of those who had been sacrificed in the name of the ritual, the blood that had stained the land for generations, the blood that had been spilled over and over again, could not be cleansed by time alone. The curse that had taken hold of the town could not be broken by simple acts of defiance or rebellion. To end it, to release the land from its dark grip, they would need to give something far more precious than life itself: forgiveness. The man's words
hung in the air, cold and heavy, like a chain around the hearts of those who listened. To break the curse, they would need to forgive. But forgiveness was not something that could be granted so easily. How could they forgive the cult for the blood that had been spilled, for the lives that had been taken? How could they forgive something so evil, so unnatural, that it had left its mark on the land itself? How could they release the unforgiven blood that had been spilled so freely, that had stained the earth for so long?
The townspeople gathered together, trying to make sense of what the man had said. Some were in disbelief, unable to fathom the idea of forgiving the horrors that had taken place in their own backyard. Others, however, felt the weight of his words. They had lost so much: family, friends, their homes, and the idea of forgiving seemed impossible. The land was cursed, and the curse would not be lifted by mere words or prayers. But the man insisted that forgiveness was the only way to free them from the grip of the land, the only way to stop the endless cycle of death and despair. But how? How could they forgive the unthinkable? How could they forgive a force so dark, so twisted, that it had destroyed everything they had once held dear? To forgive would mean to let go of the anger, the pain, and the loss they had endured. It would mean accepting that the blood that had been spilled, whether in sacrifice or in the names of those who had died, as the days passed, the tension in the town grew unbearable. Some turned to religion, praying for a miracle, hoping that some higher power would intervene and put an end to the curse. Others simply waited, hoping that time would heal the wounds, that the land would somehow find a way to cleanse itself. But nothing changed. The crops remained dead. The disappearances continued. The whispers grew louder. And then, as the full moon rose high in the sky once more, the town was faced with a terrible decision. Forgive the unforgivable and break the curse, or let the land consume them all, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but ashes and bones. The town had come to the crossroads. The price of blood had been paid, and the only way forward was to offer the one thing that could release them, their forgiveness. But whether they could find the strength to do so, only time would tell. The curse had been set in motion long ago. Now, the town had to decide whether to break it or let it consume them completely. The people of the town were desperate. The weight of the curse, the bloodshed, and the creeping sense of doom had driven them to the edge. They had tried everything they could think of, to end the nightmare that had taken hold of their land. The prayers had been endless, day and night, calling upon any deity they could imagine for mercy. The elders had offered sacrifices, burning incense, placing offerings at the edge of the cornfields, hoping the spirits would be appeased. They even gathered in the dead of night and burned the ancient altar to the ground, thinking that destroying the place where the blood had been spilled
might somehow sever the connection to the land's dark power. But nothing worked. The curse was too strong, its grip too unrelenting. It was as if the land itself had been poisoned, and nothing could cure it. Each day, the town seemed to lose a little more of its life. The crops remained dead, the streets grew emptier, and the whispers in the wind grew louder, almost as if mocking their attempts to fight back. The people had tried to escape, but even the ones who had left returned, only to find themselves driven by an unbearable pull to the land. No matter how far they went, the curse seemed to follow, stalking them in the shadows, always just behind them, waiting. The fear was all-consuming, but the one thing they had failed to acknowledge, the thing they had pushed aside in their terror, was the truth that had been there all along. The cult was still out there, still lurking in the shadows, biding its time. The figures who had once emerged from the darkness of the cornfields had not disappeared. They had simply retreated, watching, waiting for the right moment to complete the ritual they had begun so many years ago. They had waited for the town to crumble, for the people to be broken, for the blood to be spilled. And now they were ready to finish what they had started, to bring about the final, irreversible act that would seal the curse forever. The cult, once thought destroyed, had never really gone away. They had been waiting, hidden in the same cornfields that had become a graveyard for so many. They had blended into the shadows, watching as the town tried and failed to escape their grasp. They knew that the people of the town had reached the breaking point, that their fear and desperation would drive them to make one final stand. But the cult wasn't afraid of that final confrontation. They had known all along what the cost would be, and they were ready to collect it. It was then that the people gathered together, their backs against the wall, with no other choice but to face the darkness head on. The town survivors, the ones who still had the courage to fight, marched toward the heart of the cursed land. They gathered at the edge of the cornfields, their hands clutching weapons, torches, pitchforks, and anything they could find to defend themselves. They knew they were walking into the belly of the beast, but there was no other option. If they didn't confront the evil now, it would consume them all. They stepped into the fields, their hearts pounding in their chests, knowing that each step took them closer to the altar, the center of it all. The land seemed to close in around them, the thick rows of corn growing taller with each passing second, casting deep, suffocating shadows over their path. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a vortex, until the air was thick with them. The ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet, and the very earth seemed to tremble, as if it were alive, breathing with the life of the curse itself.
When they finally reached the clearing, they found what they had feared, the altar, still standing, untouched by the flames that had been set to it. The stone was stained with blood once again, the same blood that had soaked it all those years ago. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to shift and writhe in the moonlight, as if the altar itself was alive, and standing around it, cloaked in shadows, were the cultists. They hadn't changed. They hadn't aged a day. Their eyes, hollow and empty, glowed faintly in the darkness, fixed on the people who had dared to approach. A leader of the cult stepped forward, his voice a low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. He spoke of the blood, the final blood that was needed to complete the ritual. He spoke of the pact that had been made, of the promises that had been fulfilled, and the price that had yet to be paid. The people of the town, trembling in fear, realized what had to be done. The final blood had to be spilled, the last sacrifice made to complete the curse. But there was a catch. The final sacrifice was not to be taken from just anyone. It was to come from someone who carried the weight of the curse in their veins. The last living relative of the original bloodline that had made the first pact with the land. The leader of the cult turned. The air grew thick with tension as the cultists raised their hands, preparing to begin the ritual. The townspeople were paralyzed with fear, knowing what was about to happen, but feeling powerless to stop it. The full moon above them seemed to glow brighter, casting an eerie red light over the altar, and the land seemed to come alive, responding to the call of the ritual. As the leader of the cult began chanting, the air around them shimmered, and the earth beneath them seemed to crack open. The final blood, the blood that would seal the curse forever, began to flow, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. The ground opened up beneath their feet, and the people of the town were dragged into the depths. Their screams echoed across the fields, but they were swallowed by the earth. And then silence. The land had claimed its final price, and the curse was sealed. The fields remained silent, empty, and still. The town, once full of life, was now nothing but a memory. The spirits of those who had been sacrificed were said to roam the cornfields, waiting for the next victim to cross their path, to pay the price of the unforgiven blood. Some say the curse was finally broken, but others still feel the presence,
lingering in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. If you ever find yourself passing through Nebraska, be sure to stay on the road. Don't venture into the fields, for the land is still cursed. The shadows still linger, and the price of unforgiven blood may be yours to pay.